All right, welcome, Matt Dixon with Purple Patch Fitness, and we're lucky today to be joined by Dr. Mike Lord. Mike, thanks so much for being with us.
Thanks for having me, Matt.
No, good stuff. And by way of introduction, Mike and I have known each other for several years now. In fact, your partner is Sarah Piampiano, one of the Purple Patch Bros. And beyond your work with Sarah, you've worked extensively with the whole broad range, the whole broad family of Purple Patch athletes, all levels, including being our sort of resident San Francisco sports medicine expert, and obviously working with all of the Purple Patch pros that are based locally, which has been super. By way of background, you went to the Palmer School of Chiropractic, which is obviously very sports influenced, and you've got a broad range across many sports. Yeah, you're not just an endurance athlete type of sports medicine guy, no?
Right. Now I've worked with rugby teams, with CrossFit athletes. I work with the Oracle team for the America's Cup when they were in San Francisco. So all types, shapes, and sizes. That's
super. So today we want to talk about a subject that we've talked about extensively, and it's sort of come from both sides of the fence when we're managing our athletes. Obviously, you're working with the injured athlete and trying to get them back onto the field, and I'm trying to prevent the athlete from getting injured so that we can continue to excel on the performance lens. But we, in a unified manner, have had a lot of discussions around this. So we're going to talk about the main subject today, breaking the injury cycle. Yeah. So what do we mean when we say that? Why don't I hand that to you? What do you mean when we say we want to break the injury cycle?
Yeah, so the injury cycle is, I would define it as someone who's had successive injuries in a row, and that could be the same injury that's been recurrent, or sometimes that's injuries that may change location, goes from an Achilles to a knee to a hip. But they don't seem to be able to get out of that cycle to get back to consistent training.
That's and I think that one of the things we should establish first is, yes, we must acknowledge that some people are very lucky and genetically blessed, or whatever it might be, that they just by nature very robust.
Yeah.
On the flip side, what we're going to dive into today is more of the behavior around the injuries that, even though they're doing with best intentions, are maybe not helping themselves break that mold. So it's not necessarily the case that if you do have a high propensity for injury, that means you're just going to be injured the whole time. That's correct to say that, isn't it?
Yeah, these are the people that end up with the mindset that they're injury prone, or they think that they're fragile because they just continually get injured over time. The phrases I hear in my office are, running, I think, is bad for me. It's breaking me down, so I should probably stop. Or after this race, I really need to take a break and rest to let my body recover. Those are the kind of phrases that I hear, and that usually tips me off that this person's already having that conversation with themselves.
Mm-hmm. And when we think about sort of the person, I think that you talked about the mind shift or the mindset. We're going to preach today a shift in mindset, aren't we? So let's go into sort of the common misconceptions of what this athlete that is, and I guess before, just to tangentially, what we're talking about here is mostly, it's all of the common injuries, yeah? So it's Achilles, hamstring, knee, groin, the sort of soft tissue type injuries. That's what we're dealing with, yeah?
Yeah. So we're talking about the plantar fasciitis, the Achilles tendonitis, the itises, as we call them.
All of the itises. That's a super way to talk about it. So we're gonna pitch for a shift in mindset. So let's think about the common mindset. What are these athletes? What are some of the mistakes that they go through in treatment cycles? Not just themselves, but also I think physical therapists as well. Other sports medicine people don't necessarily always hit the nail on the head of actually getting out of this cycle. Yeah.
Yeah, it's a bit self-perpetuating, because when you get into this cycle, the mindset is to become many times very narrow and focused on the particular injured tissue. What treatments or types of therapies can I start throwing at this injury to make me better? If you end up in the cycle long enough, you end up on this kind of wandering journey of trying to find the magic bullet. of what's the one thing that's going to get me better so I can finally get back to what I want to do. And the common mistake that both the athlete and sometimes the therapist makes is that they're managed away from training and managed away from loading. And they're kind of put into this protective space where they believe, and sometimes the therapist perpetuates this, that rest is really the best way to get them better. And so they're avoiding training and they're avoiding the loading that I believe, and I think we've found, tends to make people better.
Yeah, so that my hamstring hurts, I better rest. So I cease activity, and if I go 10 days with doing nothing, when I come back, my muscle tissue will be rested and it will be able to accept load. But of course, if we do that spread over the course and we take the 20,000 foot view,
yeah,
if you have 5 injuries over the course of a year, and then you're missing all of that opportunity to actually build what we call the robust athlete.
Yeah. It's these cycles of breaks away from training. So in our conversations, we've kind of identified that it's not so much that the injury is the problem; it's that the rest that people take because of an injury becomes the problem. And there's these kind of long breaks that happen throughout the season that kind of takes away the resilience from the athlete, and they become less resilient to training loads because they're constantly taking time away from training. And that's the mindset change, that the problem isn't so much the injury when you've entered the cycle now, it's really that you constantly are seeing rest as your best option.
Yeah, and I guess one of the red flags of someone that you might go to for treatment to go and sort of look at this is if the lens that the supposed expert looks at is purely symptoms based. Yeah. So your Achilles hurt, I'm going to ice the Achilles. Your hamstring hurts, I'm going to ice the hamstring. Would you say that that's sort of an immediate red flag if there's no more global conversation that's going on?
Yeah, kind of. The way I would say that is there's got to be a plan that's kind of mapping you from point A to point B. And if everything's focused on the tissue itself and trying to calm the tissue down and really just limiting symptoms or minimizing, putting fires out essentially, and there's never anything that's starting to build up the robustness of the athlete, or you're never challenged with some form of load, and there's never a conversation that takes place of what can you do right now that still keeps you training. Like if there's none of that happening, then that's where I start to see issues, and people are constantly focused on just calming down that injured tissue, but there's nothing beyond that takes place.
So let's move to the positive. Let's sort of move a little bit towards the path of action. So we sort of said, we said what you don't want to do globally is purely rest, because if you have these long periods of inactivity, of pure rest, the body might regress to the mean, but you're not actually creating a robust musculoskeletal system, so you're not progressing along. So there's two things to explore, at least from my coaching lens, and you tell me if I'm wrong here. I think that, and I'll give you a couple of statements or a statement and a question. The first is most injuries, when we think about symptoms, need a little bit of load or stimulus to help facilitate recovery. So that's a statement, that's a question. And then the second thing is, what can an athlete do? And bearing in mind that most of our athletes are triathletes, so we have 3 disciplines, which is of course a gift when it comes to training, because if you can't run, then you can swim and bike necessarily. Right. So let's then move into that. But let's first sort of investigate my question. Most injuries require a little load or stimulus to facilitate recovery. Would you say that?
Yeah, absolutely. So, while acutely initially there's many times there's some break or something that needs to take place to just kind of calm things down, ultimately there has to be some load to stimulate the tissue to start healing. So the simplest analogy is if I wanted to make my bicep stronger, I would start lifting weights and challenging the bicep to do something, and that's just loading it. And so if I'm trying to heal an injured tissue, you need to do something to stimulate some adaptation. So there has to be some loading to the tissue to start changing the current state of the tissue. And it's as simple as that. And obviously there's details and things for each injury, but ultimately there has to be some sort of form of stress on the tissue to create the adaptation.
Yeah. Yeah, what you're not promoting here is, hey, I've really pulled my Achilles badly, so just keep running at the regular training load. Yeah, there's adaptations, and there might be some acute rest initially on that particular activity that's
Yeah.
but to get it to strength again, we have to load it.
Right. So basically what you're trying to do is create this more robust tissue so that it can accept the training loads. So if you don't do anything to it, you just rest, not only is the injury probably not really healing and it's not really going the right direction, you're also not, you're also detraining. So the tissue is now not getting the training load and you're not challenging it through therapy at all. So the tissue itself becomes less resilient. And that can be the setup for the cycle of the injury, which recurs in the same exact location, because not only are you not training globally, but you're not training the local tissue at all either. And so the thing we want to look to is actually we need to be able to develop kind of this these resources so that your tissues can absorb stressors. And to develop those resources, you have to challenge the tissues. And so that sometimes maybe has to start at a very low level, but should ultimately be kind of continually increasing the challenge.
Yeah, so utopia, if you go through this cycle where, and it leads to like the magic word where what we're seeking is the same thing that we're seeking in just pure performance lens. We want progression and we want consistency. Yeah. So from a keeping you on the field type thing, we want to create a robust vessel so that you can be consistent. But there is, sometimes you have to start very basic to progress yet. Let's talk about utopia, because I think it's a fact as well that as an athlete develops years and years of training, we've all met them. We've all met the athlete that said, I've been training, I've been doing strength training and my endurance activity, whether it's an old crusty runner or it's a triathlete that's doing it for 5 years. And it's very rare that they get injured.
Right.
But that's not by accident, yeah. That's I mean, they are by definition robust versus someone entering the sport has a much higher risk. So let's sort of go to that person, the robust person. What's happened there that's built resilience?
Right. So I guess we could even just call this out and say that the difference between that athlete and the one who's been stuck in the chronic injury cycle is they've been able to develop a huge reservoir of resilience and a long period of consistent training. And more often than not, that person's not just training, doing easy days. They're training hard over a long period of time. And what we find is that athlete, because they've been training consistently and because they've been training hard, they become more resilient. So if that athlete's confronted with some stressor, so that could be, a tight hip or a tight ankle or a tight calf, or even something that's not internal, could be, I haven't slept very well because I've been stressed out at home or at work, or, my nutrition hasn't been great, or any one of those types of stressors. They have the resources to absorb that without it creating an injury. Whereas someone who's kind of stuck in this chronic injury cycle, who's not stressing their tissues consistently and often, and isn't on that kind of progression towards greater resilience, something small can actually create an injury because they just don't have the resources to withstand it. So the idea being that by training hard and training consistently, you actually become more resourceful and more resilient. It's
they've built the concrete and steel structure versus the straw structure, yeah, and so which I think is even structurally or metabolically, and I don't like to talk about. Well, I love to talk about myself, but I don't like. But I don't like to go back to my own athletic history, but I was actually one of those people that was resilient from a musculoskeletal standpoint. But what I wasn't was resilient from a hormonal standpoint. And I had a house of straw on that. And when I started doing Ironman triathlon with the help of crazy coaching, I had this huge load, and systemically I wasn't robust enough to deal with probably not a crazy training load for some of the other professionals. It's just that I didn't have the background to do it. And so it comes back to that word progression again, doesn't it? Really smart progression. Yeah,
maybe something I glossed over a little bit is often when people are on this path towards progression and they get knocked backwards, it's oftentimes because there's an inappropriate spike in in intensity or training load, right? It's the person who goes from, running a little bit to all of a sudden they're doing 50 miles a week, and they've made a significant jump from where they were, what they have been doing, and their system just can't tolerate that load. And it's not so much that I think the common frame people think of this stuff is, when they go out and run and they get injured, say they have an Achilles issue, they think, well, what's wrong with my Achilles that set me up for that injury? And there's definitely things out there that I could predict are going to make you more susceptible to that. But it's probably the fact that they had that huge spike in training load that just overloaded, and that was the weak link on that day. But I think that the spikes are the problem, and that consistent progression over time that's right for the particular athlete is the important part.
It's hard to execute. Even it's hard for a coach to execute with patients on that, let alone the athlete. So we're not saying that part is easy, but it's certainly I completely concur. Now I want to go back to a point that you made that I think really important and worth revisiting. You said these athletes that have become robust are training hard.
Yeah.
So there's a paradox here, a paradox of perception. Let's call it that. Because we think of naturally training as something that strips you down.
Yes.
And training is a stress. It is a stress that applies, but if it's appropriate, it's a stress that is applied and we can respond to positively. So while it is a stressor, you adapt to it and you become fitter, stronger, more powerful, etc. And everyone gets that with fitness conceptually. We want to apply a stress and then we want positive adaptations. But what we're saying here, what you're saying here, is that it's exactly the same from a musculoskeletal standpoint. Training should be a builder of resilience, so it shouldn't strip you down. And that's, I think, at the heart of the shift in mindset. Yeah, this is important to build resilience.
Yeah, I think that's a simple way to say it. That kind of goes back to my original statement about the comments I hear in the office. Training's breaking me down. I need to take a break after this race. And, I have a great example of someone who's pretty well versed in kind of sports psychology, sports medicine, and a good athlete themselves. And we had this exact conversation. He's had repeated injuries in many parts of his body, and he's training for this marathon. And he said to me, do you think I should take, 3 months off of running and just really focus on getting healthy again? And I said, no, this is the exact reason you've continually had injuries, because you haven't been able to consistently train for a long period of time. So the idea that rest is helpful and training breaks you down is the myth that we want to change. That training actually builds you up and rest breaks you down.
I tell you, it's music to my ears, because it's one of the things one of the battles that we face with athletes is when they finish their season at the end of the year in September, October time, they go on complete endurance vacation, and then they come back in January and they're like, oh, I'm racing in April. I need to get cracking.
Yeah.
Those are the athletes that are way more susceptible to injury and way less likely to make the big leaps forward. So we always talk about the value of postseason. And I think what's necessary is, it doesn't mean the training stimulus always needs to be as hard or the same type of focus. You can go through some real technical development and some rebuilding of structure, but you must stay consistent. That's really the magic. Even if you want to back off the amount of load and do some other fun activities, we must stay really consistent with the activity to actually have the outcome of resilience.
Yeah, absolutely.
Or it's a self-fulfilling, self-made injury cycle where you're just taking a break and all you're doing is detraining the musculoskeletal system, and when you retrain, you obviously go back to previous training load, but the body's not ready for that.
Yeah, and I think what you just said there is probably the part that gets lost. People have the perception of where they think that they are in training, right? Mm-hmm. So the injured athlete comes in and they've been away from training for a certain amount of time, but mentally they still think that they're able to tolerate this particular training load. But because they've been in this cycle, they've slowly detrained. So then when they go back, they think they should be performing at this level they were at previously. And it's that jump and that the mistake is made. The same thing, what you're saying is they jump from an off-season training volume, which may be nothing, right into where they think that they should be because that's where they were before, and
Yeah.
that's a great way to get injured.
Yeah, it's a great way to get injured. Well, let's actually sort of finish with a little bit of a case study, because we work with one of our elite athletes, elite amateur athletes, one of the best athletes in the world at an amateur level. And she came to us, Laurence, she came to us, and we both, the great thing about Laurence is when she came to Purple Patch, she almost a parallel timing, a few months behind, started working with yourself. So we've gone on this journey with Laurence over the last couple of years. And by way of introduction, she comes from a very high level, Olympic level swimming background, and zero running background. So she's best swimmer in the sport, very strong cyclist, and developmental as a runner, and has everything that you would expect from a swimmer. You know, this is her foot, very legs down, not designed as a land mammal, basically.
Right.
And here is our mission to turn this athlete, this wonderful woman, into a robust runner. And I guess that the other thing that she had from a technical standpoint is the style that she was running when she joined us would only maximize the potential of injury, because she would land on the ball of her foot with all of the shock and all of the stress coming straight up her lower leg, for lack of a better phrase. So she was not robust by any stretch of the imagination, was she?
Right. She wasn't robust from a running perspective, and she also, because of her previous athletic background, she wasn't designed, or she hasn't been trained to absorb the running stress. She's not springy, and so she was coming to us with this running style, which a springy athlete would run with, and so it was kind of the wrong approach to running with the wrong body type.
And I would add to it as well, but the two things she did have, which in this case worked against her, was her rich athletic background. So she had a huge engine.
Yeah.
And she had the understanding of suffering and the ability to work hard. So she had great work ethic, huge engine, willingness to suffer, with a chassis made out of sort of balsa wood in many ways. And so she went through a few cycles of injury, yeah? And it was our shifting mindset that now has got her towards on this path of robustness. But what I want to focus on is your interventions. I'll take partial credit, but it's really your interventions on the training approach with to try and with the viewers watching cast, well, this is how we do it. So we knew she could swim. You know, that was obviously a continuation of her training program. Biking was non-weight bearing. We could continue to bike and use the full range of intensities, but it was how we went about the running that was unique with her. So why don't we talk just a little bit about sort of the general prescription of what we did in running? Yeah,
I think some of the conversation we started with is what's the level of running that Laurence can do that creates consistency. And so instead of kind of ramping up and pulling back and ramping up and pulling back, we kind of shifted the mindset and said, all right, well, let's just change what she's doing on a given week. And so those are things like some interval run walks. So we would just decrease the prolonged pounding, break it up a little bit. Some more treadmill walking, which we found for a couple different reasons. I think it helped her gait and her ability to kind of just learn towing off and just the movements, but also is helpful from a strength perspective, just engaging more muscle groups. So a lot of the treadmill walking is at a significant incline, just increasing her posterior chain strength, so kind of glute, hamstring, calves. And then we kind of looked at the overall week and we said, well, maybe we don't have her running too many consecutive days in a row. And we kind of have these inserted mini breaks of just a day off here, day off there. And that over a period of time creates resilience for her because she's got now consistent running, consistent loading without having to pull back at all. And we can really see how she's responding to it.
And you know, fast forward now a few months in, she's, you know, I sent her on an hour and 40-minute run the other day. Now we did it all on soft surface to enable to enable the risk to be down. We integrated walk breaks into it, but had her doing that without any risk at all. But a year ago, no, we were really, really patient on that. 2 days on, 1 day off. And just one thing that I think you said, but I'll sort of double down on, the hill-based walking was fantastic because it built resilience. It built the brain talking to the everything that's happening behind her, which she just couldn't talk to from a neurological standpoint. It wasn't intuitive. So there was skill acquisition. And what that did naturally, because we're on a hill as well, is it changed her foot plant. And we can't tell her to land more full-footed. We want that to be a byproduct. But by doing this, what ended up happening was it naturally transitioned her to move towards running that was a style that was more suited to her frame and her characteristics.
Yeah, we put her in a position to be successful by having her do the hill walking. And we had the conversation with her of, this more full-footed stride is probably going to be better for you. And we gave her some drills and you said it's kind of skill acquisition exercises to really support that as well. But the hill walking, and a lot of this was feedback from her as well. She noticed that when she would do the hill walking, it would immediately translate into her run.
Yeah, that's good. And I think that the other, from a coaching standpoint, so many athletes would wonder, well, hang on, you've got this athlete doing a bunch of walking, only running a couple of days in a row at the very most before having a day off the legs. You're not actually putting that much intensity in there. But that's the beauty of triathlon. The sport is swim, bike, run. And so what we did from a cardiovascular standpoint and a range of intensities is we loaded up that side of stuff on the swim and bike. And, throughout all of last season, which was not completely injury-free, the front part of last year, we had to go through sort of some of the lessons. And sometimes it does take time, even for the team globally. Yeah. But the back half of the year, we established being injury-free. And look, she's a talented athlete, but off of that compromised running from a classical sense, but we should say appropriate running for her because it created consistency. She got third at the World Championships, second at the World, I can't remember, second or third at the World Championships. She'll kill me if she got second. It's off the top of my head now, I should know.
I think it was second.
Second at the World Championships. Well, we'll give her third and tell her to work harder next year. But on the podium at the World Championships, and a super performance, but also a platform now that this year, as she goes through, we can up it a little bit. Yeah. And it comes back to the journey. And then the final thing as a case study, for, staying on the case study for her, but we've been talking about this, is the key component of, we're not just talking about therapy here. Like, this is the value of strength training, strength and conditioning. So that encompasses mobility and real strength work, not little core work, not Pilates, serious strength work as a performance enhancer, stealing that word back or that phrase back. And the key supporting elements that you talked a little bit about, nutrition, sleep, and all of that, the SMART training program, it's all meshed into one, isn't it?
Yeah, I mean, I would almost list off like a number of kind of habit changes that I tend to talk to people about. And this is stuff that we've talked with Laurence about, among others. One being, if you've been in that injury cycle, we don't need to wait for your body to be feeling 100% before we start back to training. And that's often a mistake, as people are waiting for this moment when their body all of a sudden feels great to get back to training. And starting early and finding how much you can do is really important, and focusing on what it is you can do, not focusing on, well, I can't do this, and then just shutting it down. I think another big change is kind of making sure that you develop an internal awareness of how your own body is feeling and how you're responding to training. So you become accountable for what's happening within yourself, and you're not just looking at the training plan that's written on paper, expecting that to be perfectly designed for you, because there's too many variables to account for. So you have to be personally responsible for how you're feeling and how you're adapting to the training. Mm-hmm. I think that a big one is, you mentioned already, but getting out of the treatment room and into the strength room. I mean, like, can't stress that enough, but there's two things happening there. One, you're getting the strength training, you're stressing the system, you're loading the tissues in a different way than you normally do with swim, bike, run. And that's really, really supportive. The other thing is mentally, if you've been in that cycle, mentally, when you start to do strength training, you really learn that your body's robust and you really can feel that your body's responding to that strength training. And it's a real psychological piece that I find important for people. Then there's kind of the things that you preach about all the time, but going hard on the hard days, but also going easy enough on the easy days. And I can't tell you how many times that's people missing that simple rule ends up in injury for them because they kind of end up in the middle ground, right? And then beyond that, it's kind of committing to the supportive practices on a consistent basis. So doing the foam rolling, doing the strength training, doing the kind of warm-up activation work before you go out training. So those kind of habit changes are the details of how you execute on a plan to break that cycle.
It's a super way. It was very strange a couple of minutes because I felt like I was looking at myself in the mirror, listening to myself, and which I do.
You're a pretty good looking guy.
Exactly.
I said you're a pretty good looking guy then.
I didn't realize I was so charming and good looking, Mike. But and, the final thing I'll say, because it's fantastic, but this is, we have some great examples of purple patch athletes that have lived this, that have made this change, and just this last couple of weeks, actually, it's such a great timing to have this conversation. I remember almost this time last year, we had two athletes, one woman based out of New York, one guy based in the Carolinas, and they were both absolutely perpetually stuck in this cycle. And they almost had, the loyalty membership card to their physical therapist that they were swiping and swiping and swiping. And both of them were delivered a message. And I was the one that had to deliver the message. And I can't say the language that I used, but I wanted it to be impactful. But I said, out of the treatment room, and you need to go and get strong as, and that's period. That's what you need to do. And they both embraced that. And I think with fear, trepidation, and thinking that we were lunatics, I burden the responsibility. You were the brains behind the operation. But the outcome of that, it was wonderful. This last weekend, I saw a note to say, I never thought I could have truly run and raced a whole half marathon off the bike. And the New York woman did that at Chattanooga. She raced and ran the whole thing, pain-free, injury-free, with a great performance. And the gentleman in the Carolinas has not been injured since. This is a guy that had his loyalty card punched once a week for his physical therapy. He hasn't been in the office for a year. He's just robust. And I mean, two great, utopian examples. It's not that this is the route to never face injury. It's not to say that a purple patch elite athlete never gets injured.
Right.
But it is a route, a path to minimize and break this vicious cycle.
Right.
So yeah, super stuff. Mike, thank you so much for spending the time. I think this is going to be really, really valuable. We're going to have a series of these discussions over the coming weeks and months, but it was super. Thanks so much for joining us today.
Yeah, thanks, man. It was fun.
Take care.